All right, everybody, maybe we will get started now that Rich has joined. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Cork. I'm the Association Manager of IHEA's activities. Welcome and thank you for registering for today's webinar, Economics of COVID-19, Exploring Key Issues of Impact on the Economy. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes and it will be recorded and uploaded on our website afterwards. Before beginning the webinar, I just want to run through a couple of housekeeping items. If you experience any technical issues during the webinar, please write them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be happy to assist. Everyone on the line has been muted except for the speakers in an effort to eliminate background noise. We also ask that you keep your video turned off to preserve bandwidth. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the chat box. Time has been left for discussion and questions following the presentation. I'll now hand it over to IHEA's president and the chair of today's webinar, Winnie Yip.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining this webinar, which we announced only on Monday. And since then, we have received over 300 people who have registered for it. So thank you for your support for it. There's no question that COVID-19 is now an issue that every one of us face, no matter which part of the world you are in. And in addition to the huge cost to human lives and health, the virus, of course, and condition have also caused major costs on the economy and other social impact as well. And if you compare COVID-19 to SARS, there are two unique characteristics that make it slightly different than SARS is because this virus transmission can be asymptomatic. So a lot of countries is choosing to lock down or ask their people to stay home, to work, to close schools. And these have huge impact on the economy and also on children going to school. And the second difference is that between now and the previous and SARS, the economy is much more interconnected and interdependent. So we're very pleased to have Richard Smith, the Deputy Pro VC of University of Exeter, to share with us his work on examining the effects of COVID-19 on the economy. And this is the first in a series that we intend to organize. There will be other webinars coming along, so stay tuned to that. So without saying more, Richard.
Thanks, Winnie. I've literally just got back in again. It keeps dropping in and out. So if I just vanish, apologies, and I'll try and get back in again. Are there some slides that someone can push up? Because I've had such a lot of trouble with this. I'm not sure about sharing slides.
Yep.
Is that possible, Nicole? Can you do that?
Yep.
Fabulous. Something's happening on the screen. That's good. Excellent, thanks. So, yes.
So let me just talk a little bit about how we plan to organize this hour. Richard will do a presentation and you can send your questions through the chat box. I will try to keep track of them and present these questions to Richard so you can have a discussion with him. But we would also like to reserve the last 10-15 minutes or so to encourage people to say a few words for those of you who want to. If you are doing any research that is related to the economics of COVID-19, and if you do that, do try to limit it to just about 1 minute so we can have opportunities for others to speak as well.
Hello.
Hi.
Whoa.
There you are.
We'll get only in. Right. Do you have another go? Is anybody still there?
Yeah, everybody's still here. I'm going to reshare your slides for you.
Okay. So I have no idea what slide you're showing, so I'll kind of...
Just the first one.
I'll just say as we go along. Okay, so yeah, so the idea, this is kind of the first in hopefully a series. And the idea was just for me to present for about 20 minutes on work I've done in the area, leading up to kind of work on the current outbreak, giving a bit of context, a springboard for some wider discussion of experience perhaps of other health economists in other countries in terms of their contexts, how we might approach this current crisis as health economists in terms of research and policy advice and so forth. So next slide. So why is it important? Well, largely to date, I guess we've been treating this as a major health crisis quite naturally, but it seems clear now, and particularly if you look at The Economist, it's rapidly turning into an economic crisis, which will have much longer and probably deeper implications going forward, not just economically, but as many people will be aware, the huge wealth of evidence on social determinants of disease means the longer term implications of what's likely to be a major recession will be pretty significant on population health, and could well be that the implications of that far outstrip the impact of the current pandemic. So major challenges, major changes ahead on how economies operate and the role of the state and the nature of our health and social care systems and so forth at a very broad macro level, which is what I want to just talk about now for a few minutes. So next slide. So we've been here before in many ways. There's been a number of major outbreaks of international concern even this century, from SARS nearly 20 years ago, through MERS, through Ebola, some avian and swine flu thrown in as well. And SARS is where I first came into this space, I guess, as a health economist, working at the time with WHO, the World Trade Organization, on trade issues and public goods. But spent a reasonable amount of time working with David Heyman, who's come back on the news, certainly in the UK in recent times, looking at revisions to international health regulations. And in a sense, the main kind of output from that activity was recognition that our usual way of working in health economics within much more of a microeconomic and health system focus was really missing the key issues there, which were definitely focused on macroeconomics and at that point, especially trade. So next slide, Nicole, are you still hearing me?
Yep.
Yep, good. So we brought together kind of thoughts on that in a short piece on health economics, and probably worth just reading a little bit of the abstract on this. This is where we argued that the traditional health economic analysis is ill-equipped to estimate cost effectiveness and cost benefit when we're looking at controlling and preventing public health emergencies of international concern, like a pandemic or SARS, or as we currently have with COVID-19. The implicit assumption of partial equilibrium and the economy as a whole is violated by those emergencies, and so we were proposing an alternative with a very specific aim of accounting for behavioural changes and capacity problems that are expected to occur when an outbreak strikes, which kind of was interesting looking back on this paper. Now it seems kind of fairly prescient. So next slide, Nicole. This is a diagram actually from later work that was on Ebola, but kind of illustrates the sentiment behind this paper. In essence, what it's saying is that we are, and increasingly so, in a very complicated, complex, interconnected world. And our health and health systems are very reliant on our economic foundations, but increasingly are dependent on those around us. So the old phrase about no man is an island, certainly no country, no economy or no health system is an island. We're very interconnected. And what we need is a way to kind of model those ranges of interconnections and where our health impact comes in, and then kind of feedbacks through that situation. Next slide. So there's a lot of options for doing that, and we tried several of them. We tried some growth models at a very broad level and quite crude. We looked at another model like compact model, which Simon Wren-Lewis at Oxford was looking at and still is, I think, and we reported on that in Health Economics, for example. All of those have limitations, everything does, of course, but we kind of settled on the CG, or the computable general equilibrium approach, which seems to offer quite a lot of sensitivity and flexibility and feasibility, really because it's quite a micro-based macro approach, so you tend to work upwards from the sectors of the economy rather than working downwards from the very broad level kind of indicators. And next slide, Nicole. And that's an approach that we've used in a whole variety of settings, from swine flu in Mexico, public health financing in Uganda, Alzheimer's in China, climate change in the UK, palm oil in Southeast Asia, and a number of other areas. So it is a very flexible and fairly sensitive and feasible model to use. So next slide. So before sort of talking about how we've used it in the pandemic context, I thought I'd just say a few words about what it is, on the assumption that most health economists have probably not used it or not heard much about it. It's what its name says. It's a general equilibrium model, which means it's solved. In a sense, it's kind of forced, because economies don't tend to be in general equilibrium, of course. But it's solved to find prices at which quantity supplied equals quantity demanded across all our sectors, and therefore across the economy as a whole. It's using agents that we'd be familiar with, so consumers and producers and government, and they do pretty much what you would expect. And then we have import and export functions, which can be more or less elaborate, that link our economy, our country typically, into the rest of the world and its trading partners. So next slide, Nicole. In essence, then, what we have is kind of an initial state of the economy, which is in equilibrium, as I just said, and then we shock it, and typically health shocks tend to be negative. And then we see on the right-hand side what the new and shocked state of the world is in terms of reductions in supply, smaller profits, changes in consumption patterns, and so forth. And we run a whole series of scenarios to determine different sorts of trajectories between our initial equilibrium and our new one, according to a range of different assumptions or different policy decisions and so forth. And the outcomes down at the bottom are fairly high level, so things like GDP and employment and inflation, exchange rates and so forth across the economy, or you can get into each of the particular sectors if you want to. So next slide, Nicole, should be a flow chart. In terms of running the model, essentially what the foundation is a thing called a social accounting matrix, which if you're familiar with input-output tables, is fairly similar and uses a lot of that information. Essentially gives us a picture of the economy in terms of some sectors and our flows between them. We then specify the models. That's things like what numbers of sectors do we want. We could have 10, or we could have 1,000 different sectors, depending on how aggregated and disaggregated we want the model to be. Determining whether it's kind of static, it's a one-period model, it's dynamic, and it changes over time, whether it's a kind of fairly closed economy or open, and so on and so forth. And the model has a set of elasticities that govern the flows between them, and then bringing them together, we produce a benchmark equilibrium. That's effectively just reproducing our starting point of the social accounting matrix, and provides a kind of a consistency check that the model actually kind of works in a technical sense. And then we're ready for policy analysis. And it's worth noting, if you're interested in using this, CG models rely on some fairly well-established solution algorithms available as software packages. We use one that's called GAMS, which is Generalized Algebraic Modeling System. There are some others around, and it provides a set of syntax which declares the sets and data and parameters and variables and equations and things, and it's kind of a very good starting point and basis for development. We've done a lot of development of ours to integrate epidemiology and demographics into it, so ours looks quite different now, but it's a very good place to start if you've not kind of used these things before. So next slide, Nicole. Really just to say, obviously there's strengths and weaknesses across all sorts of models. Nothing's perfect. But as I say, over the years of using this in a number of areas, we still feel it's a fairly sensitive, flexible and feasible model. So it is quite a usable and user-friendly, as these things go, way to do things. Next slide, Nicole. So having said all that, what about CGE and pandemics then? So following kind of SARS towards the end of the 2000s, there was a lot of concern about something essentially like coronavirus, something with a kind of a case fatality rate of SARS, but clinical attack rate or R0 flu. And at that time, that concern was phrased as pandemic influenza. And we did a set of work at that point across a number of areas funded by ESRC, the European Union, working with the Bank of England, looking at the impact, particularly on the UK economy and the wider European economy, of what a severe pandemic flu outbreak might do economically to the macroeconomy. And these were kind of the core UK papers, and they're relevant. Why I put them up is because they're relevant to the template for our quick and dirty analysis of the potential impact of coronavirus to the UK, which I'm going to tell you about in a moment. And so you can read more about those papers, are publicly available, of course, so you can read essentially what we've done in those papers, although the results obviously are different for the current pandemic. It's also kind of interesting to reflect on the results of those forecasts when we get to the current situation that we're in now. Next slide, Nicole. Should say at the top, what do we model? So hopefully kind of we're keeping pace with each other. So what we model in all this, oh, great. And you're still there, so that's fantastic. At least one person still left. Clearly, disease impact is the main thing we're going to model or utilize in a sense, based on the epidemiology. And we translate that mostly into a labour force shock. There are issues about, consumption and grandparents looking after grandchildren so their parents can go to work and bits and pieces. But the main thing is about labour force shocks, and it reduces it temporarily or permanently depending on the severity. But it's equally critical, as we'll see in a few minutes, to look at the likely behavioural change that the disease outbreak will bring about in terms of avoidance behaviours and consumption patterns and things, and how long those behaviours go on for and what they are and when they start and so forth. And then also, of course, policy response, so interventions that are designed to affect the epidemiology then start to affect the economy. And our EU study actually was really useful here because we did a huge survey across a whole number of European countries on likely behavioural and policy impacts of particular scenarios of disease outbreak. So next slide, Nicole. So this is the kind of the results from that analysis back in 2009 on the potential impacts to the core variable of interest, GDP, at the time for the UK. So don't worry too much about, there's lots of bars on here, but really those are just representing a whole set of scenarios around how serious the outbreak is and whether we do things like close a school or we have antivirals and so forth. The key here is if we benchmark the global financial crisis, so the last recession in the sense that we had at the turn of this decade, we lost something like 2.3% of GDP in the UK and about 4.5% globally. And we were suggesting that a major pandemic could hit nearly 6%, and that was kind of unheard of at the time. But everywhere else across that graph, as you can see, it's kind of less than 2%. So, and except for the very severe case, it's less than 2%. And that extreme value was not driven particularly by the severity of the disease, but by the fact that that entailed, at the most extreme, 13 weeks of school closure and 4 weeks where basically half the workforce stayed at home. And in 2009, we sounded like we were really quite extreme and on the edge of sanity at that point when we were suggesting that, and it sounded quite melodramatic. And it's kind of interesting to reflect on that now, given what many countries are currently doing. So keep a couple of those figures in mind, and we'll move on to the next slide, Nicole, which brings us on to the current pandemic. So as I said, we, in essence, did a fairly quick bit of work to largely replicate this earlier UK analysis of pandemic flu. And partly due to at the end of February, there was a school half term, which meant we paused a little bit. So we actually completed that work on the 12th of March. And I have to say that now seems like a complete lifetime ago. And oddly, kind of everything that we had in the paper seems to have actually materialized. Hopefully that's not cause and effect, but anyway. So next slide, Nicole. So what we did this time was, rather than lots and lots and lots of scenarios, which we had in that previous work, and I showed you on that graph with lots of bars on it, we had just 3 scenarios. First was looking at the disease. So if we essentially, as a society, ignore coronavirus, let it come and sweep through the population, it'll cause a lot of health implications. But if we just carry on otherwise and don't do anything different, then what would be the impact of that? Obviously, people don't just let things happen like this and don't do anything. So the activity that we've done last time on behavioural change was really important, and bringing that into a second scenario. That's essentially what we're now calling social distancing. And some of the results from the EU project I mentioned earlier are kind of illustrated in the graph in the corner there, if you can see it. And basically, at certain tipping points of awareness of severity of what's going on, people start to do things, and they do it really pretty quickly. What tends to happen at that point as well then is there's pressure on government to act, and governments have had a lot of time to produce pandemic preparedness plans covering lots of things. And so our third scenario brings those in as well. And they obviously then feed in all these, the latter two scenarios particularly feed into the core underlying epidemiology and lead to a possible reshaping of the curve. So if you go on to the next slide, Nicole. So by now we've all become, if we didn't know about it before, aware of the epidemic curve and the concept of trying to flatten it. So in a sense, what we were doing was saying, well, if we go for scenario one, that's more or less what the red line is here. That's kind of just letting the epidemic do its thing, and it will be a hugely steep climb in cases and in deaths, and then there'll be a fairly sharp decline over a fairly short period of time. Scenario two is sort of the green line in a sense of social distancing seeks to kind of flatten it, whether that's voluntarily doing things that are socially distancing or government mandated, but nonetheless, that's what we're trying to do. Scenario three here, which we haven't got into, and I'll come back to in a couple of minutes, is it brings in the potential for double peaks and for things like multi-year models or multi-period models at least. So I'll come back to that because we haven't modelled that at the moment. So next slide, Nicole. So this is the headline UK results. So what did we get out of running that? So remember, at this point, this was back in early March, so these were all forecasts. None of this was observed at all. Really, certainly in the UK, it wasn't. It was consistent with the work we'd done before, which was kind of interesting in terms of what would happen in the event of a severe pandemic that I said about back in 2009. In the sense that scenario one, you get massive health impact for the lowest economic effect. But of course, that's kind of an interesting baseline or benchmark, but isn't going to happen at all in reality. Scenario two is much more likely. People react, possibly a little bit of policy in there to support social distancing. People don't go out so much, they don't use public transport so much. Various things that we saw in the previous epidemics and pandemics I mentioned earlier, like SARS and MERS and so forth. And we get a considerable ramp up in the economic impact because of that. So you've got roughly sort of trebling the economic impact, and you're already up to that sort of 2.3% that was our kind of prediction as the from earlier. Most of our scenarios from previous analysis was less than 2%. So we're already kind of getting above that with this already. It impacts across different sectors differentially. So the obvious immediate cases are travel, tourism, hospitality. They're all impacted the most severely. And again, that's absolutely consistent with stuff that we did before and observed from something like SARS. But of course, the biggest impact economically is scenario three, which is essentially what we're now calling lockdown. So again, we get roughly trebling again of the economic impact from scenario two. So we get the biggest impact, of course, on health in terms of saving lives, but we get by far the largest economic impact. And at that point, we're talking about over 10%, which is very substantial if you bear in mind those figures that I threw up earlier about the last recession from the financial crisis, and the sorts of the 6% was the absolutely ridiculously extreme value that we predicted for pandemic influenza. So we're quite a way above that at the moment on these predictions. There's kind of a weird twist. There's a bit spooky at the end because we sort of just divide one by the other, and you end up with around about 1.2 million per life saved, which is not too far off the UK's recommended value statistical life in government decision making. I'm sure that is purely chance, but it's a bit weird to find out. Anyway, next slide. Hopefully you're still with us because I'm getting near the end. So in conclusion, so this is consistent with the work we did previously. So we have this increasing impact or scale of impact as we move from just the disease through the behavioural reactions and through into policy, which is then kind of presents an interesting dilemma for policy itself in terms of what should be done to kind of balance the health and the economic impacts. And the core driver in a lot of that is actually the case fatality rate. It's not so much how infectious things are, it's what the implication is if you catch it. It's driving things much more than anything else. Next slide, Nicole. So it's also kind of interesting because at the end of our analysis in terms of the paper, we obviously went for some recommendations. So okay, so we have these huge economic impacts, but that's important to know because it means we need immediately that we bring in some of these policies around lockdown. We need some mitigating economic policies if we're not to fairly devastate particular sectors of the economy and really impact on the economy overall. And there are probably some fairly obvious things for people. So supporting liquidity, so having cash is really important. So things like delaying mortgage repayments and giving loans to businesses and who have to shut, like cafes or restaurants. Tax rebates, we've seen cuts in interest rates, quantitative easing programs coming back in again, like we did with the financial crisis, and good old Keynesian pump priming. So beginning with healthcare, so shovel a lot of money into healthcare is also quite useful. What's interesting, of course, is that pretty much all of those things then came to pass almost the day after we submitted it. So what next? So next slide, Nicole, should say what next at the top. So obviously, being really early on this means that we're now the first to be completely obsolete. So our model is now completely outdated and has been totally superseded by events over the basis of about a 1 to 2 week period, which was surprising to say the least. We're updating it, so we're now involved in another European funded project, Rapid Funding, that came through. So that's literally just started this week, looking at a lot of what we've done before in our work on pandemic influenza and SARS and Europe, now looking at the current one. Really key ensuring we have a dynamic model now for multi-period to account for that potential for second waves or third waves or for this going on a lot longer than a short, sharp shock. And also key to work through some of the assumptions based on our previous work and outbreaks concerning things like bounce back, the extent of possible structural change and so forth. So kind of the unknowns in Donald Rumsfeld's words. So next slide, Nicole. So to give an example for this is from some of the work on SARS. This is empirical observational stuff. So one of the key things is how quickly do things bounce back. So you may have a drop-off in consumption or in production, and it pauses for a while whilst there's an outbreak. And then as soon as essentially the all clear comes out, people get back to doing what they were doing before. So you can get a bounce back up to more or less the same level. So you've kind of just lost in that short period of time. And in some areas, you bounce back beyond that. So for consumer goods, often people don't go out and buy them during an outbreak, but they will buy them as soon as it stops. So you kind of catch up in terms of the demand and the industry. For other areas, particularly services, of course, if you've missed going out to the restaurant, you don't go twice the next week to make up for it. You've kind of lost those forever, but nonetheless, it's kind of a short period. If we're going into a much more extended period, or we're doing repeated measures to bring us in and out of waves, then that kind of concept and that observation might break down. And it might generate some structural change, of course, as well. Next slide, Nicole. So that was kind of a run through. There's the silver lining that one can look for in everything is there's obviously a lot of opportunity at the moment, and certainly in the UK and Europe, a lot of funding now for this research. So given that we were hoping to sort of broaden this out, as with the series of webinars on some discussion and interaction, is hearing from others, but just finishing with a few thoughts, possibly, to generate that. So I'm aware of some things that have now been done and produced as working papers. So it might be that some people on the call have already done some work in their countries, be interested to know what you've done and what kind of you're finding from those. The value of these sorts of models versus our empirical observation, especially given this really fast, I've never had something happen so quick in 2 weeks that made the paper that we had largely obsolete and irrelevant in such a short pace of time. They're usually irrelevant at some point, but not that quick. And at what point kind of are we in things, and what does that mean for things like I just mentioned, like bounce back, are there likely to be structural shifts, and how do we account for that in these sort of analysis as we're going forward? So I thought probably just finish with that left up there and hand back to Winnie and hope that the line is still working and I'm still on.
Great, Richard, thank you very much for this stimulating presentation. We have a number of questions, so I'm going to group them. One set of questions is perhaps relating more to the model. One question is, can you say a bit more about the time units of your model? It seems that you compare the effects on a yearly basis, but she's wondering whether there are alternatives to this choice and the accuracy of the estimates. So relating to that is also another question. The work that you did for SARS, and in retrospect, have you compared your prediction to what actually happened as a way to validate your model? Then there's another question: how can SMEs bounce back in this immediate crisis situation? Then there's another set which is more relating to what extent your model incorporates some of more of the health system changes, and I'll go to that later. I'll let you answer this set first. Richard? Hi, Richard. Have we lost him again?
Sorry, I need to unmute, don't I? That's right, yeah.
Right.
I'm on the phone this time. So on the first one, on the time limits, so these models can take any time period. You typically take a year and multiples thereof, kind of an annual change. That's often because of the data that underpins it is produced on an annual basis. We took 1 year for the previous work on pandemics, largely because they do tend to be at least envisaged as a short, sharp shock that comes in for a period of time and then goes. As I said at the end there, that's what we need to think about, and that's what we are now doing in the revisions, is a multi-period model, because if we're having second or possibly more waves, particularly over multiple years, then obviously we need to be able to account for that. But also, with the potential depth of this as an impact on the economy, we need to look at the future years' impact. It's not going to be that last slide or two on the sort of the SARS impact where there's a sharp decline and a sharp return and then things carry on. It's highly unlikely that's going to happen. So there's going to be spillover effects down the line. And that was definitely true with Ebola, for example, because there was impacts on the agricultural system in the year after the major initial outbreak of Ebola. And for many of those countries, their GDP didn't return, well, when we finished analysis about 3 years after, and they still haven't returned to where they were pre-Ebola. So we need to do multi-year. When it comes to other areas like non-communicable diseases, etc., I mean, and the greenhouse gas paper that I threw up right at the beginning, we've done that over, I think we did that over 30 years or so. I mean, obviously the predictions by end of 30 years are, how much you want to believe them, I don't know, but you can take it as long as you want. So the second point on SARS, that's kind of interesting because the information I threw up on SARS specifically, like the graphs at the end, that's the observational data. So at the time, we didn't do a predictive model on SARS, partly because it was SARS that led, in a sense, as I said in that kind of paper early on with partial equilibrium in the title, that I can't remember the rest of the title of, that kind of made us realise that it was really key in this area that we did these kind of macro approaches, and we started using this approach, or exploring macroeconomics in terms of antibiotic resistance. we sort of had dipped our toe in that, so we started thinking about that in terms of this area. So we really only first applied it in terms of those predictions around pandemic influenza, not SARS. But what we did do was compare, I don't know if the paper was up there, we did a paper on swine flu in Mexico, which was observational, and the observations there were fairly close to what we thought would be the impact from our modelling. So, you know, you're never spot on with the model, but we weren't massively off. And it's kind of interesting to look back on our 2009 pandemic impact on the UK paper. And in many ways, they're not that far off if you just ramp up the scenarios we had to be even more extreme than we had. We would probably be not far off our 10% impact that we're discovering is probably going to be the case now. Third question, Winnie, I've forgotten now. What was the third question?
That's all right. Let me, because so for those who are participating, if you have sent a question and we have not answered it, we would actually be sending them back to Richard, and he will try to do that and post it on IHEA website. So we will try to be responsive, because there is another cluster of questions that perhaps I would like you to turn to. I think this is a set of questions that relates to linking health system impact to the economy. So for example, does your model account for the crowd out of other health issues, because did you account for the additional health loss because of the overloaded health facilities, because of people who might have health chronic conditions but were not able to seek care? Another question is, did you account for the constraint in the supply of ventilators and other PPEs and the impact on the health and mortality of the health workers? Another health system related question is, compared to before, digital health actually have come into use very widely. I don't know if that's the case in England, but definitely in China. To what extent you can and would be able to account for that effect as well? So I'll let you answer first. Okay.
Yeah, that's really interesting questions, and it'd be interesting to hear how other people have potentially incorporated some of those. So I guess one thing to say is, with these models, particularly from the economic side, in some ways you're always slightly behind the curve. So you've not got kind of the total kind of real-time data going in. So to some extent you're slightly behind. If we think about some of those impacts on the health system that we've seen coming forward, particularly in the UK over the last month, a lot of those weren't happening in February, so some of those were not particularly in our mind. And also is thinking through how you put them in this sort of model. So when it comes to the health system side, we don't make any assumptions on capacity to deal with things. I think that's what a lot of these questions come down to, isn't it? It's saying, as the disease expands, the concern about flattening the curve has been to keep it within the ability of the system to deal with the number of cases that's coming forward. And that's to do with things like intensive care beds, but also the PPE and the ventilators that was mentioned there. We make no assumption on that. So essentially our assumption is no, to be correct. Our assumption, I guess, is that the health system is scalable. So if you're treating 1,000 patients at the moment and we would have 4,000 patients next month, we would assume that you can scale up to treat the 4,000. That's clearly a limitation, and we're seeing that as a major factor at the moment coming in. What's interesting is how that would affect through the system, because it would have some impacts on labour supply, and it will probably have some impact differentially. At the moment, in the UK, given lockdown, what you'd have to do, I guess, is look at that situation in the context of a locked down economy rather than a fully operational one. So, being really crude, I imagine you can sustain more losses to your labour supply when you're in lockdown than you can without. The real impact will be when you're trying to emerge out of the current situation and you've lost workers. So in terms of the economy, that's probably where things would kick in like that. In terms of just the health system itself, we don't model into the health system. We just take it as one of our sectors, and then we take the epidemiology that comes out, and that's based on our starting assumption is that we scale up the health system. If it can't be scaled up, then we would bring it in really through that change in epidemiology. So if you're experiencing more fatalities than you should do because your health system can't cope, then that would feed through into the epidemiology of the model.
Great. So for the participants, we definitely will be planning another webinar later on that examines more on the health system's effect. So stay tuned. There's another cluster of questions I think relates to is your model applicable to low-income country and settings with limited resources, and therefore the economy might be structured differently and their interconnectedness with the world might also be different. So it's a few questions are all related to that.
Okay, well, the simple answer is yes. In the modelling approaches, the model we've set up for the UK is not, because it's specified for the UK. So I mentioned the work we did with the pandemic influenza stuff. I focused on the UK version, which was those two papers I put up. But there's another set of papers that deal with European countries. So that's fine. In terms of low middle income countries, we've done some work there. For example, the work on palm oil. I mean, it's a completely different topic, but that's based on a number of countries in Southeast Asia. The work on health changes to health financing reform was Uganda. So it is applicable. It just needs setting up for the country itself, because what you've got to base it all in is that social accounting matrix, and that has to be a representation of the economy that you're interested in.
So a set of questions is relating to data, which you also pointed out. The model, of course, is critical in terms of the quality of the data. Can you speak a little bit on that, on what are the challenges that you see, and just comment on that?
Okay, so I guess there's three kind of core areas really. So one is the fundamentals to this, as I just mentioned. I mentioned go through the presentation, is this social accounting matrix. So you have to have a good representation of your economy to start with, because that's what your baseline is going to be based on, and you're going to go forward from there. Because essentially, if you've got a static model, you're essentially replacing that year's economy with a different year's economy, so to speak. If you've got a dynamic model, then you're changing the pathway. So the pathway from what's likely to be the current trajectory with a changed trajectory based on a health impact or policy impact. So you've got to start with that. And countries are better or worse on that than others in terms of how readily available that is. So there are a set of social accounting matrices that are around, that you can take. They're not available for all countries, and some of them are older than others. Those are what you'd want to use if you wanted to get moving fairly quickly, and they were available. But again, they might be 5-10 years old, so you'd have to do some adjustments to them to bring them up to kind of more of the modern day. If not, you're going to have to construct one yourself, which is just a bit laborious, really, more than anything else, and is based particularly on things like the input-output tables that I mentioned. So you've got that. That's one side of the data, and that's nothing can happen without that being as good as you can get it. The second set is kind of related in this case to the health impact, for example, which is going to be around the epidemiology and the demographics. So when we started this, obviously you would have you'd have to translate that into workforce changes. So you'd have a drop or an expansion or a change in composition or productivity rate of the workers within the economy, and that might differ across sectors, for example. The development we did at the MRC Methodology Grant Funded was to integrate an epidemiology and a demographic model the CG so that they could feed off each other, because otherwise, particularly if you're getting into dynamics, you've got something that changes the economy changes, and then that impacts on disease profiling, etc. And that has to feed back into the epidemiology, which if you're doing multiple years, you'd have to do yourself the translation. So that kind of was mechanized, which sounds way simpler than it actually was, to mechanize that link. And the epidemiology, obviously, you're just reliant on others. And we've been very lucky working with some epidemiologists that are very closely linked into Public Health England and are involved in the epidemiology modelling imperial that is driving the UK policy. So that's just been lucky for us. And then the third area is kind of the data around the other things. So kind of the scenarios almost. So I've made a big stress on the importance of behavioural reaction by the population and by government. And our European work from a few years ago did a lot on those potential behavioural reactions, but also just watching what happens when things occur, watching through SARS particularly, but also MERS and then swine flu and all the rest of it, what happens, all the way from trade barriers as a response and a reaction at a certain level, all through to individuals just not using public transport and seeing that kind of collapse within cities. And that is increasingly important because that's what's driving the economic impact here. It's not the disease, it's what the disease is doing to people's behaviour and what it's doing to government policy. So you need a set of data around that. Sorry, that was a bit long, Winnie.
Great. I have, last set of questions is, are you engaging with policymakers with your findings? How are they taking it? If you are.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. So engaging with policymakers. Yes and no, in a sense of yes, because a lot of what we did earlier on after the SARS, and particularly all the stuff around the pandemic influenza in the 2008, 9, 10, 11 sort of period was driven by policy in a sense. So as I said, we did some work and activity there with the Bank of England. They run a model that's not too dissimilar to CGE, so that's good because they kind of understand all that, but not specified sufficiently to probably go into the detail and sensitivity on their health impacts. So we did had some discussions with them, for example. Obviously, this sort of work was useful for thinking through stockpiling of antivirals, of Tamiflu and that sort of thing from years ago. Thinking through issues around interventions that are visible and influence public confidence to encourage them to continue behaviours rather than those that discourage them, for example. So that's all there. What's happened with this one, which has been kind of interesting, is just the speed. So those, as I said, it's basically maybe 3 weeks ago now that paper was finished and was making, forecasts on if this happens, then this will be the economic impacts. We really need to think about these policies, guys. And about 3 days later, you've got schools closing, and another 2 days after that, you've got, lockdown of industry, and 2 days after that, you've got, the policies coming out for quantitative easing or all sorts of things. So what's been interesting in the policy context, certainly in the UK with this, has just been the rapidity. Almost every day there's a brand new thing that's come along, and in some ways the policy and probably the politics of it are running faster than the advice can probably keep up.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that we're seeing this in not just in England, in other parts of the world as well. We have a few minutes left. There are still other questions coming in, which we promise we'll send to Richard. But we are also curious, how many of you might be who is still online are actually doing this sort of work in your country context, and or maybe whether there are other economic impact work that you're doing that you might want to share with us. You can just, I'm having a hard time looking at the raising hand, but if you just send to the chat box and say, I would like to say something, I'll invite you. We have very little time left, and again afterwards, we'll send out a message to invite people to submit and tell us what they might be working on that is related to the economics impact, and we might convene another webinar later. Anyone want to share what you might be doing in the remaining 2 minutes? We need to let people go in 2 minutes because that's what we said the time frame is.
Probably just say, Winnie, that I just apologise for dragging out the introduction to this by my technical mishaps over here.
That's all right. We're all struggling a little bit with technology, and I'm sure Zoom is having a very, very heavy traffic. Okay, so I want to thank Richard and also all the participants who have signed up and participated. Again, we will be sending out messages to encourage you and remind you that to submit to us what are some of the work that you're doing related to the economics impact or other implications of COVID-19. And we will be organizing other seminars, webinars, so stay tuned for that. And if there is enough interest, I hear definitely would be interested to consider perhaps facilitating collaboration for people who seem to be working on similar ideas that you might find it beneficial to collaborate and work with each other. That's one of the mission of IHEA. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you.